Shwmae pawb, hello everybody, croeso and welcome to my wild Welsh garden. Before I start the video, I just want to say that there's still the mystery of the missing comments. I do appreciate all the comments that you give me, and if I don't respond, I try and respond to all of them, and if I don't respond, it's because they've got lost somewhere. But I do think somebody asked me about the siskins and what I was feeding them. Well, it's sunflower hearts, and they absolutely love sunflower hearts. In fact, they love them so much that they keep eating them, even when I'm standing in the doorway of the kitchen filming them, when most of the little birds would have flown away. And just because it's super cute, here's a film of a blue tit feeding their babies. I've filmed it through my kitchen window, so it's not brilliant. The baby blue tits are very similar to the parent, but they're fluffier and duller. They don't have the same blue cap that the adults have. So in this channel, I'm sharing my journey wilding my garden. I used to be a conventional gardener for nearly 50 years. And then last year, really just in response to the decline in wildlife in the UK, but particularly here in Wales, I decided I would change my way of gardening and garden putting wildlife first. Conventionally, what we do in our gardens is really for the benefit of human beings. We want a beautiful space to spend our time in. So it's all about how things look. It's about flower colour and flower shape, flower size. It's about length of flowering. It's about the different sorts of foliage, different sizes of plants and shrubs, about foliage colour, foliage texture. It's about combinations of plants, combinations of colours, combinations of plants and shrubs. And it's all about making a beautiful space. But now I'm a wild gardener. I still want my garden to be beautiful, but rather than just thinking, well, what will things look like? I'm asking myself, well, what would be best for wildlife? And it's not about not intervening. It's not about just letting nature take over. It's about intervening in a way that will be best for wildlife. Some of you are wild gardeners already and have been doing it a lot longer than me and know a lot more than I do. But if you are a gardener that would like to maybe be a bit wilder and would like to follow my journey, wilding my garden, then please like the video, please subscribe to the channel, and I hope there'll be something for you. So this week I have been thinking about doing a spot of wild gardening. Now, conventionally, this is the time for pulling out the early flowering annuals, things like forget-me-nots. And the reason for that is they are prolific self-seeders, and it's about reducing the amount of seedlings that germinate. But also they begin to look very sort of straggly, and they get mildew and they don't look very nice. It's also the time for cutting back the early flowering perennials. So the rule in gardening is that you always cut back after flowering. And there are a number of reasons for that. One of them is to promote new growth, so to promote a nice flush of new leaves. It can be to promote new flowers later in the season. It's about keeping the plant in shape, maybe keeping it tidy, maybe stopping it from outgrowing its space so it doesn't crowd plants around it that are maybe going to flower later in the season. And again, if it's a self-seeder, it's about preventing that happening and preventing your garden from being taken over by whatever plant it is. This is one of the plants that I would be cutting back at this time of year. This is the perennial candy tuft that had those lovely white flowers earlier in the spring. And I'm just left with these spent flower heads and a few seed pods, and I would normally be cutting it back down to about there. In fact, I started over that side of the slope underneath the azalea there. But then I noticed a lot of this stuff. This is cuckoo spit, and it's produced by the nymph of a froghopper as a sort of protection to stop it being eaten by birds. And I thought, well, if I cut all this off, I'm going to be destroying all those creatures. I mean, some people might think that's a good idea, but if I'm gardening for wildlife, I'm putting wildlife first, then I need to look after these baby froghoppers. So I've decided not to cut this back at the moment. So becoming a wild gardener does involve quite a lot of changes, really. I'm constantly sort of questioning what I've always done and challenging myself. And the question always has to be, well, what is best for the wildlife? So now I'm wondering what to do with all these aquilegias. This one still has quite a few flowers, so I'm not going to do anything with it yet. And the bees are still visiting these flowers. In fact, I think this little bee has spent the night here. I think it got left out last night and has spent the night just clinging onto the seed head there. And what I've always done previously is when they get to this stage and there's no flowers left, I've cut them right down to the ground. They won't flower again, but they'll produce some new foliage, and of course it will stop them from self-seeding all over the garden and mean that next year I won't be submerged in aquilegias. At least that's the theory. Well, now I'm questioning that and wondering, oh, won't these seed heads be useful for wildlife? It's very difficult, isn't it? But then if I go back to the theory and ask myself, well, what would happen in a natural ecosystem? There's a major component of a natural ecosystem missing from this garden, and that's the large herbivores. And a large herbivore would come along and eat these, wouldn't they? So that's my job, to take the place of the missing components of a natural ecosystem. So I have to do the job of a large herbivore. But in a natural ecosystem, they probably wouldn't eat them all. So I think that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to cut some of them down and leave some of them. And then there'll be a mosaic of habitats. And I think that's what we want, isn't it, in a wildlife garden? We want a mixture of different habitats for different creatures. One of the things I am going to cut back is my lovely nettle patch over the road. And I think that will benefit wildlife because there will be another flush of foliage which will be ready for the new generation of butterflies to lay their eggs on, for their larvae to eat. But I'm not going to cut it all. This is the side where the caterpillars are. So I'm going to leave this side. See the leaves that are curled over? They're curled round little green caterpillars. Well, I think they're big fat green caterpillars now. And I think they're the caterpillar of a moth. I don't know which one it is. But over the other side, nearer the road, I don't think there are any caterpillars. I'm going to check, and if not, I'm going to cut those down. So there you go. I've reduced it by about a half. It means that people can't complain that they're getting stung walking along the pavement. And hopefully I shall get some nice new growth for caterpillars later in the summer. And I've put the stems that I've cut off in the patch, so if I've missed anything, which I could well have done because my eyesight's not brilliant, it can crawl off onto a living stem. And while I was here, I thought I'd just see if there were enough flowers out on the bramble, whether it's worth coming to count pollinators. I think it's getting that way. And I've also done a little bit of maintenance to the pond because it was getting very, very full of blanket weed, which is this disgusting stuff. It's an algae which grows particularly in the spring in response to the strong spring sunlight. And it's okay if there's only a bit because some of the creatures that live in the pond will eat it. But if you have too much, it shades other plants and it takes oxygen out of the water, and makes it more difficult for the creatures that live in there. So when I get a lot like this, I take it out. But what I'll do is I'll put it on the edge of the pond, and if there are any creatures in there, they can find their way back. And then after a couple of days, I just put it on the compost heap. But while I was doing that, I discovered these. Those of you who've been watching my videos for a while will maybe remember that I didn't think there was much going on in my old pond that's been there for 5 or 6 years. Basically because I'd never really looked in it, to be honest. And then in March, when I was building my new pond and taking some water and some weed out of the old one to sort of start the new pond off, I realised there was all sorts of life in there, mostly invertebrates in March, mostly insect larvae, but dragonfly larvae and maybe damselfly larvae. So yes, it was actually full of life. And I also had frog spawn, but then it turned into tadpoles and sort of disappeared really. Well, I think I've discovered the reason why, and it's because of these little fellas. These are newt tadpoles, and they eat frog tadpoles, so I think that's why I haven't got any frog tadpoles left, because they've all been eaten by these guys' parents. So yeah, I'm afraid it's a tadpole eat tadpole world. But newts are just as valuable as frogs. They're just as much in decline as frogs are. So I'm happy to have a newt pond instead of a frog pond. And that's nature, isn't it? Everything is eaten by something, and these guys will be eaten by something as well. But I'm going to go and put them back in the pond and then at least give them a fighting chance of growing to adulthood. And down there is a dragonfly larvae or a damselfly larvae. And that is very carnivorous too. So that will eat frog tadpoles. So when you think about it, those poor little frog tadpoles never stood a chance really. But again, dragonflies and damselflies are just as important as frogs. They're in decline just as much as frogs are. So I shall go and put this one back in the pond. So I thought I would finish, for those of you who are interested, with the moth situation in my garden. I haven't put the moth trap out so often because it's often been raining. And sometimes when I have, it's been quite cold and I haven't found any moths at all. But I have found a few, and I'll leave you with those. But otherwise, thank you for watching. Thank you for visiting me in my wild Welsh garden. And I hope to see you again in a future video. Bye! Hwyl fawr! And there's this amazing moth that looks exactly like a stick. Tiny. How's that for camouflage? How amazing is that? Oh, fabulous. Look at that.